They've sort of dodged the front pages, but this time yesterday, Partygate, the polling of the Prime Minister, was very much front and centre. There are indications, aren't there, Kevin, that if there was a next general election call quite soon, Boris Johnson might not fare that well.
Yeah, well, he does seem to have dodged a bullet on Partygate, only getting one fine. But I think probably the issue that is probably more interesting to people and certainly affects more people is the cost of living crisis. And right now, the government is a bit like a rabbit in the headlights. They don't seem to have a plan for dealing with it. They know that something needs to be done, but they can't really decide what it is. And people notice this. People notice that their bills are going up. They notice that their weekly food shop is now 20% higher than it was this time 6 months ago. And they're looking for the government to actually do something. Now, up until now, the government have said, well, look, we did a £9 billion package in February. There'll be more help coming in the autumn. But that leaves 6 months in between when people's bills are going up. Their wages aren't keeping up with inflation, and they're sick to death, really, of an apparent briefing war between the Treasury and Number 10 as to what they're going to do. There's talk of a windfall tax. There's talk of tax cuts, maybe increasing benefits. But, it seems as though there's a sort of paralysis at the heart of government, and they're not actually just taking a decision.
Do you think that paralysis extends to the opposition as well?
No, not necessarily. I mean, there's only so much that the opposition can do. Obviously, they've been pushing for a windfall tax for quite some time, and ironically, I guess that's probably why we don't have one yet, because the government, as much as I speak to Conservative MPs, and they're instinctively against raising taxes, but at the same time, they look at the huge profits that the energy firms are making and say, actually, there is an argument for a tax, use the money to bring people's bills down. But the politics of it is, well, we don't want to give Labour a PR victory. So, that is maybe explains part of the reluctance. But I think it is going to happen, and they might as well just, do it.
Yeah, you say Conservative MPs are instinctively against tax cuts, but...
rises.
Tax rises. But Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak are obviously, they're looking at the highest tax burden this country's faced since the Second World War. So what would you say, Ella, when it comes to how you deal with this cost of living crisis? Is this about tax cuts, or is this about a windfall tax, or both?
Well, I mean, the thing is, the point to make about the windfall tax is it's incredibly small fry. I mean, really, in the grand scheme of things, it's become this sort of, as many things do in Parliament, it's become this kind of football that's thrown between the two parties, and you're not doing enough. And when you actually investigate what the windfall tax would mean for, every household in the UK, it's peanuts. It really goes nowhere near doing anything towards for example, the news coming up that energy bills might go up to £2,600. I mean, and so a few £100 from a windfall tax is going to do nothing. There is
just on Kevin's point, how much do you think PR is playing sort of havoc with actually just dealing with the crisis?
A huge amount. I mean, we know that if you watch PMQs, for example, and you've got a serious... as much as I think the Labour Party's got problems with its ability to talk about gender and things like that, you've got questions levelled at the Prime Minister of how you're going to deal with the fact that people are not just struggling but floundering, that there's the whole, and not just the poorest but across the board people are suffering. And he turns around and says, well, why would I take a question from you and you don't know what a woman is? And it's like, hang on a minute, this isn't a game anymore. We all know that the Labour Party's got a problem with what we're talking about women. Why don't you answer the question on the cost of living crisis? So there is, I think, in particular, Boris Johnson has and Rishi Sunak are in a, Kevin used the word paralysis. I think that's a very good descriptive word for it. But I think it's a studied paralysis. It's a means of sort of saying, maybe if we just do nothing, things will sort of figure itself out. They're blaming Russia and what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. OK, that's part of it. They're blaming the pandemic. OK, that's part of it. But also the government made certain decisions throughout the pandemic that it could have done differently in relation to opening up and closing down society. And they're kind of, at the end of the day, they stood there saying, well, it's not really my problem, don't really know what to do with it. And that's not on. Citizens shouldn't take that from a government that says they are literally briefing papers and saying, we are at a loss, we have no options. That's nonsense. They do have options.
So just very quickly to finish your initial point, which was you were talking about the windfall tax, raising a modest amount at best. Are you then talking about tax cuts in addition to that windfall tax?
Well, there are certain obvious things, like, the welfare system in this country is meant to be a safety net. And, you know, it's not functioning as a safety net at the moment if it can't, you know, it doesn't keep up with inflation. So on the basic level, you need to increase things like, you know, universal
Upgrade
credit.
benefits.
And you need to do that. But also, as well as the short-term issues, which are very, you know, I think they should just, the magic money tree that Rishi Sunak found throughout the pandemic needs to be rediscovered and shook a bit, quite simply. But also there needs to be a longer-term discussion about what is it in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years that the government's going to do? What are the big ideas for innovation and production and all those things that the economy has needed for decades?
You're saying we need to look short-term and
long-term.
Stop
Ella,
kind of
Kevin,
fiddling while Rome burns. Very much.